The grimdark far future of the Warhammer 40k universe has plenty of historical and literary influences from the real world. Some of them are pretty on the nose and others are a little more obscure. In this video, I wanted to go through just a few of my favourite in no particular order. So apologies in advance if yours wasn't mentioned here. I started to run out of time creating this video when I realised that there were just way more influences than I could ever fit into just one single video. So let's dive in. Konrad Curze is one of the more terrible characters in Warhammer 40k. The Primarch of the Night Lord's Legion, he grew up on the crime-ridden world of Nostromo. Born with an innate sense of justice, but with no real understanding of it or others' lived experiences, he went on to conquer his homeworld and bring peace in the most brutal of fashions. Eventually, even just hearing rumours that Konrad was nearby was enough to scare people into obeying the law. He gained the nickname the Night Haunter and was used as a bedtime story to scare children into behaving by their parents. Curze used extreme punishments, torture, and the fear they created in the populace to keep the peace. But as soon as he left to join the Great Crusade, the terrible crime Nostromo was famous for returned. During the Great Crusade, Konrad's Legion, the Night Lords, gained one of the worst reputations among any Imperial forces. When conquering a non-compliant system, they would often take as many captives as early as they could. They would then commit various acts of unspeakable torture upon their victims, including flaying them alive. All of this would be recorded as well as possible and replayed to the other opposing forces in the system. More often than not, they would surrender soon after. While this method of conquest is extreme and was considered evil by many, it did get results. The Night Lords were able to conquer vast swathes of space with less effort than many other legions, while inflicting, overall, less death and collateral damage. However, this method of conquest rarely resulted in loyalty from the populace. There's no better example than Nostromo itself. As soon as Konrad left, and with him the fear of extreme punishment, the crime rate started to go back up. Considering how unpopular he was as a ruler, it wasn't seen as an honour to fight at his side in the crusade among the people, like it was with many other legions. This meant that the only recruits he could really get from his homeworld were the dregs from prisons and jails. At the end of the Horus Heresy, the galactic civil war that tore the Imperium apart, Konrad foresaw his death at the hands of an Imperial assassin. Seeing this as the final vindication of his belief that the Emperor was a tyrant, he let the assassin Mchen, I think is how you pronounce that name, kill him without a fight. Now, there are many people who feel that Konrad Curze is the Warhammer 40k version of Batman. Now, there's plenty to support this. He has a cool nickname, he strikes fear into the criminal element of a super gothic city. Now, like everything in 40k though, this is all dialed up to 11. Konrad had no parents like Bruce Wayne, he had no problem in killing. In fact, he would often even eat people. Also, Nostromo itself is much more extreme than Gotham City. It's a much more extreme version of Gotham. It's perpetually in darkness and is ruled almost entirely by criminal gangs and organizations like that. Now, that doesn't even go into the whole bat motif that the Night Lords are famous for. The real influence of this character though, and the Legion as a whole, is actually the 19th century novella, The Heart of Darkness, and the 1979 movie Apocalypse Now, based on it. Heart of Darkness was written by Joseph Conrad, and the main antagonist in the book and the movie are named Kurtz, not Curze, Kurtz. So you just have to move a few letters around and you have Konrad Curze. Joseph Conrad also wrote the novel Nostromo, which is spelled only slightly different to Curze's homeworld. The movie Apocalypse Now was released a few years before the lore of Warhammer 40k was settling in, so I think it's fair to say that the film would have had more of an influence than the book. The death of Konrad is actually similar to the death of Kurtz. He's tracked down by an assassin, and then, before he dies, he goes into a big monologue that really seems deep when you just hear it, but if you listen properly, it just shows that the character is insane. Even the assassin's name is based more on the movie. Mchen is the name of the assassin that kills the Primarch, and Martin Sheen is the actor who plays the protagonist in the 79 movie. There are other similarities too. The director Francis Ford Coppola stated that Kurtz is based on the real-life Robert B. Rubault, a US Special Forces officer who was arrested in 1969 for the suspected murder of a double agent. The more popular theory though, which was denied by the director, but it's still more popular, is that the real-life influence for Kurtz was a guy called Tony Poe. Poe was a CIA paramilitary officer and committed some seriously heinous acts during the Vietnam War, or the Resistance War against America, as it's known by the victors. Now, just a fair warning for some graphic details. Tony Poe would use what's described as unconventional and barbaric tactics against the North Vietnamese and the Pathet Lao during the conflict. In Laos, on at least 2 occasions, he dropped severed heads into enemy locations as a kind of psyop. He also, at least once, mailed a bag of severed human ears to a nearby US embassy to verify the body count of enemy combatants. In an example of real life being actually more grimdark than any of the fiction mentioned above, Tony was never assassinated by his government for his actions. He was reassigned to a training facility for the rest of his military career and eventually received the CIA's Intelligence Star Award in 1975, the year after his retirement. He went on, he lived a long life in California and died in 2003. That story, and stories like it, would have actually been very common knowledge in the English-speaking world in the years after the war in Vietnam ended. And while Tony might not have been the inspiration for Colonel Kurtz, I think there's a lot of overlap between him and Konrad Curze. One of the most popular characters in the whole setting of 40k is easily Sigismund. He is, at least to many, prototypical of the universe as a whole. One of the greatest fighters during the Great Crusade and Heresy eras, he lived for over 1,000 years, finally losing in combat to the Chosen of Chaos, Abaddon. It took a millennium of age to dull his body and senses enough that he could be killed by another Space Marine. After the Heresy, he founded the Black Templars chapter. Unusual for a group of Space Marines, they worship the Emperor as a god and not just the greatest human to have ever lived. The Black Templars have taken after their founder and have crusaded across the galaxy for 10 millennia. It's even suggested by some that their numbers have grown so large that they now surpass even some of the original legions in size. The chapter symbol of the Black Templars is virtually identical to the German Iron Cross. So, it only makes sense that their founder is influenced by someone in German history. The Sigismund that we all know and love from Warhammer is almost definitely based on Sigismund of Luxembourg, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire from 1433 till his death a few years later. Now, I'm just going to give you a quick overview of this guy's CV. It's really interesting, and I just think more people need to know about him if you haven't already. This is just taken from his Wikipedia. He was born in 1368 and died in 1437 at the age of 69. The last male in the line of the Great House of Luxembourg, he married his first wife, Mary of Hungary, and became the king of that country by the time he was 20. By the end of his life, not only was he the Holy Roman Emperor, but he also had the crowns of Croatia, Germany, and Bohemia, not to mention Hungary. Though the crusade he led against the Ottoman Turks at Nicopolis was defeated, he wound up with an empire that wouldn't be rivaled until the Habsburgs came along generations later. In order to further his goals of defending the Catholic Church against its enemies, particularly the Ottomans, Sigismund created the Knightly Order of the Dragon. Definitely a good template for the prototypical Black Templar Space Marine. Now, of course, onto Robute Guilliman himself. He's not only the Primarch of the Ultramarines chapter and is de facto in charge of the Imperium at present, he is arguably as close a thing to the main point of view character that we're going to get in Warhammer 40k. Guilliman seems to actually be based on 2 different Roman figures, Augustus and Justinian, at least at different times in his own personal and the setting's history. In 30k, the younger Guilliman's origin story is definitely based on the life of Augustus Caesar, the first Roman emperor. His adopted father, Conor, co-ruled with another aristocrat, Galen. Like Julius Caesar, Conor was far more popular among the people than Galen, who, like Pompey, was more popular with the established aristocratic class. When Conor sent a young Robute away to fight against the rebellious Illyrian community in the hinterlands of Macragge, Galen organised an assassination. This is completely reminiscent of the assassination of Julius Caesar on the floor of the Roman Senate on the Ides of March. The elite of Macragge were worried about Conor's successor Guilliman taking over and taking too much control. They were also worried about Conor's attempts to improve the quality of life too much for the common people, as most of the population was forced to work functionally as serfs on large plantations, which would have cut into the aristocrats' way of life. After dealing with the assassins, Robute Guilliman goes on to lead the people of Macragge into a glorious age. They conquer a vast area of space with 500 worlds being a part of their greater empire known as Ultramar. About 100 years after the heresy, Guilliman was nearly killed by his brother Fulgrim and placed in a stasis field. There he waited for 10 millennia before being restored in part with the aid of an Adeptus Mechanicus adept known as Belisarius Cawl. Like Robute, Justinian was considered a master of politics and logistics. His famed general, Belisarius, was also considered an essential element to all of his successes. Together, the two men led a campaign that increased the size of the Roman Empire by about 45% in the 500s and brought places like Spain, Italy, and North Africa back into the fold. Now, just when I'm talking about Justinian or anyone like that, I might use terms like Roman and Byzantine interchangeably, so just a heads up on that. In the current setting of 40k, the Imperium has been split in two, so there's obvious similarities to the Eastern and Western Roman empires in real-world Europe. A few other similarities between Justinian and Guilliman. Justinian compiled and reformed much of Roman law into the Corpus Juris Civilis, which is still the basis of civil law in a number of states around the world. Much the same as Guilliman, who wrote the Codex Astartes to make sure that a conflict like the Horus Heresy would never happen again. Another trial that both rulers had to deal with was plague. In Guilliman's case, the plague wars were fought against another chaos-corrupted brother Primarch, Mortarion. They caused untold destruction, mainly in the area in and around Ultramar itself. Justinian, on the other hand, had to deal with the Justinian Plague, which lasted from 541 to 549. He contracted the disease himself about a year in, but he survived. The plague hit every corner of his empire and the surrounding regions. It's estimated that at least a fifth of the population of Constantinople died as a result of it. In 2013, researchers confirmed that this plague was actually the same bacterium that would be responsible for the Black Death in Europe around 800 years later. A 40k character that's definitely on the nose and very much influenced by a real-life historical figure was Lord Solar Macharius, the greatest human general in the Imperium's history. He rivaled even the Primarchs, the genetically engineered super soldier generals that the Emperor created, specifically to conquer the galaxy. He's heavily based on the real-life figure of Alexander III of Macedon, or Alexander the Great. Neither figure lost a battle and both managed to conquer an unprecedented amount of territory. Also, upon their untimely deaths, their conquests erupted into civil war as their generals squabbled among themselves for control of the newly conquered regions. Lord Solar Macharius was from the imperial world of Donia and became a member of the High Lords of Terra and essentially the leader of the Astra Militarum, or Imperial Guard. In just 7 years, he conquered 1,000 worlds for the Imperium and expanded its borders more than anyone else since the glory days of the Great Crusade. The only thing that prevented him from going any further were his soldiers. Exhausted from combat and terrified of going into the supposedly haunted Halo stars beyond explored space, they refused to go any further. Macharius died on his way back to Terra to report his conquests to the other High Lords, though there are other claims that he was poisoned in fighting a traitorous general who had succumbed to the temptations of the Chaos God Nurgle. There's obviously plenty of overlap between these two figures, not to mention how both were functionally worshipped after their respective deaths. Okay, so this connection is a little lighter than many of the others on the list, but I still think there's a strong literary and historical influence on this character. So Imotekh the Stormlord is the Pharaon, not Pharaoh, of the Necron Soutech dynasty and controls about 82 worlds. He is regarded as one of, if not the strongest Necron lord since their reawakening in the 41st millennium. Now, unlike many of the other Necron pharaohs, not pharaohs, Imotekh wasn't necessarily from royal stock before the Great Sleep. He was a famed general of the Soutech dynasty. Their leader was one of the few not to survive the 60 million year-long slumber. In the subsequent Intercene civil war that ravaged the dynasty's throne world of Mandragora, Imotekh was awakened in the hope that he would help one of the factions finally succeed. Instead, he created his own army and led it to conquer much of nearby space, leading him to becoming one of the most powerful Necron leaders in the current setting. The homeworld of Mandragora is actually named after a real-world plant of the same name. The plant was famous in antiquity for its healing properties, which is fitting for the home of someone named after Imhotep. He was a real person. He worked for the ancient Egyptian pharaoh, not Pharaon, Djoser, and lived sometime around 5,500 years ago. Now, his exact position in the Egyptian court isn't certain, but he gradually became worshipped as a god in the centuries following his death. Imhotep became a god of healing and wisdom, along with pre-existing deities like Thoth, Thoth, I don't know how to pronounce that word. Now the thing is, I personally doubt that the Necron is based entirely on the real world figure. I think that at least a large part of his character is based on the villain in the Mummy film series, the original from the 1930s and the first two movies starring Brendan Fraser. Imhotep is the main antagonist of all three, and the character is more in line with the ego, the pride, and the longevity of the character Imotekh from the 41st millennium. Okay, we have another Xenos faction character now, Prince Yriel, the son of the Lyandon craft world and one of the most infamous Eldar corsairs in the galaxy. He commanded Lyandon's fleet in the craft world's defense against a chaos invasion. Though successful, the recklessness of his tactics left the civilian population vulnerable to attack, and a portion of the enemy's bombardment got through. This led to the deaths of countless Eldari. For a dying race, any death is considered a huge loss. So, in spite of the fact that he won the battle and fought off the Chaos invasion, Yriel was exiled from his home. A band of his most loyal followers and warriors left with him. This fleet of ships became known as the Eldritch Raiders and became one of the most notorious groups of Eldari corsairs in the galaxy. Even though his relationship with his home craft world was strained, he would come to its defense centuries later. In the late 41st millennium, Lyandon came under attack by the Tyranid Hive Fleet Kraken. He led a courageous counterattack that broke the Hive Fleet against the craft world's guns. Though he was taken back by his home and his past transgressions were forgiven, for various reasons he still kept to his roaming, raiding ways, at least for a time. The main influence for Yriel has to be the famous English sailor Francis Drake. He led the first English circumnavigation of the globe, the second overall, which finished in 1580. That year he returned to England and received a knighthood by the English monarch, Queen Elizabeth I. Unfortunately, he didn't really help relations with the Spanish. As a privateer, he raided towns and plundered ships all over the world. This contributed to England's war with Spain. In 1588, Drake was second in command of the English forces that repelled the famous Spanish Armada. The following year, he led the even larger and also failed English Armada to Spain. Like Yriel, Drake went through various stages of exile throughout his life. He was also regarded as a fairly reckless, swashbuckling pirate by many. At other points in his life, he was a member of the British Parliament and was actually involved in some of the earliest English slaving voyages at the beginning of the Atlantic slave trade. The English still love him though. His ship, the Golden Hind, is in dry dock in London and you can visit it today. The Spanish obviously hated him and they called him El Drac, I think is how you pronounce that in Spanish, or the Dragon in English, which is actually, I think, more of a compliment than they may have considered. Right, there's plenty of English historical figures as the basis for characters in Warhammer 40k, and that makes sense. The setting was created in England in the 1980s. I do have to give an honourable mention to another figure closely associated with that time and place. So, one of the most famous figures with a real-life influence in the setting is Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka. The greatest orc in the current setting, countless greenskins march in his name all across the galaxy, and he's caused destruction all around the Imperium, most notably on the world of Armageddon. The common misconception among fans of the setting is that Ghazghkull was influenced by then British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. Now, first of all, this is actually hilarious, I think. It would be great if it was true, but I want to give a quote from Andy Chambers, one of the original 40k creators. So this is from social media. There's a photo on screen now as well. I share my response here for general amusement and edification. The real answer is far more arcane than that. In the early 80s, my friends and I used to do live role-playing. It wasn't called that then, but that's what it became in later years. We played monsters a lot, particularly orcs. So we worked out basic orcish based on the bits of black speech in Lord of the Rings so we could communicate without the adventurers understanding what we said. In that framework, Mag Uruk Thraka equals Big Orc Leader, Ghazghkull equals Metal Skull, coincidentally the son we called Gash Kull equals Fire Skull, no Maggie involved. We were doing our best to forget about the Wicked Witch. So there you have it from the source itself. I hope you've enjoyed this quick run through some of the countless literary and historical references and influences scattered throughout Warhammer 40k. I might do another video on a topic like this again, so if there are any more that you think I should mention, please let me know. I want to make sure to thank the 40k lore subreddit and Bell of Lost Souls for some inspiration on the characters mentioned here. This video was my first real attempt at creating some full-length content for YouTube. I hope to do more in the future. Make sure to like it, subscribe, and share the video around. It helps a huge amount. Thanks a million for watching.